The Scots language is one of the three indigenous languages of Scotland. Scotland's other languages are English and Gaelic. English is used throughout Scotland, while Gaelic is spoken mostly in the Highlands and the Western Isles. Scots is spoken throughout mainland Scotland and in the Northern Isles. Scots has some 60,000 unique words and expressions. It is the language of a magnificent, centuries-old literature and was once used by kings, politicians and ordinary people alike. Scots today is spoken on a continuum. Some people use more and some people use less. Some of us use the occasional word or expression such as wee, scunner, bonny, peedy or peely wally. Others speak in rich, broad Scots, complete with its own pronouns, prepositions, grammar and word order. Scots has a vast vocabulary, a unique history and a wonderful literature. It has a range of features and sounds that are never used in English. For these reasons, most linguists and academics today agree that Scots is a language in its own right. The Scots language came into its own during the Middle Ages. It was at this time that Scots took over from Gaelic as the main spoken language of lowland Scotland. By about the year 1450, Scots had also replaced Latin as the main language of all official documents in Scotland. After 1462, all of the statutes or laws of the Scottish Parliament were recorded in Scots. Scots was the language of state during the Middle Ages. Scots has always been used by poets and storytellers. The medieval wars of independence were written about in Scots. James I was Scotland's first poet-king. While he was imprisoned in England, he wrote a long Scots poem called The King's Quair. Scots language in the medieval period was especially rich and expressive, and became increasingly different from English as time went on. Mary Queen of Scots spoke French and Scots, and her son, James VI, wrote excellent poetry and prose in Scots. But James VI of Scots was soon to become James I of Great Britain. With the union of the crowns in 1603, he set off from Edinburgh to live in London. From this point on, James began to favour writing in English. Some historians view this as a sad period in Scottish history. It has been said that the departure of this brilliant poet-king and his followers to London was a hammer blow to the Scots language. But in reality, Scots proved to be very resilient. During the 18th century, Scotland became the centre of a great flourishing of scientific and philosophical learning known as the Enlightenment. As Scottish writers published for a southern audience, they tried very hard to develop what they felt was proper or correct English. Starting in 1752, long lists of Scots words were drawn up to enable writers to avoid them. The great Scottish philosopher, David Hume, famously checked his manuscripts in order to rid them of Scotticisms. Although prejudice developed towards Scots language throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, Scots continued to be spoken by ordinary people across the country. The Scots language survived in the speech of millions of ordinary Scots and in their songs, ballads and poems. Eventually, in the second half of the 18th century, there was a great flourishing of poetry in Scots. This revival culminated in the great poems of Robert Fergusson in Edinburgh and Robert Burns in Ayrshire, the poetry which most famously brought the Scots language to the world. At the beginning of the 19th century, the Scottish novelist Sir Walter Scott became the world's most famous writer. Scott wrote his Waverley novels in English, yet he wrote the speech of his kindly, rural characters in broad Scots. The millions of Scots who made their way to the cities to work in factories and mills during the 19th century were mostly Scots or Gaelic speakers, and Scots remained very much alive in their communities and writings. Scots prose continued to appear in newspapers during the 19th century, often in the form of articles campaigning for social justice. At the same time as Scotland was moving swiftly forward into urban and industrial times, Writers and scholars were also becoming increasingly interested in the past. Some of these antiquarian writers began to write down the Scots lyrics of the old country ballads, which had been sung for centuries. In 1808, a scholar called John Jameson published the first Scots dictionary, the Etymological Dictionary of the Scottish Language. The Scottish Renaissance was a cultural and intellectual rebirth that happened in Scotland in the 1920s and 30s. This Renaissance was led by an eccentric, combative poet known as Hugh MacDiarmid. MacDiarmid completely reinvigorated the Scots language in his masterpiece, an epic Scots poem called A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle. MacDiarmid inspired a great number of writers and activists. In the 1950s and 60s, interest began to revive in Scottish traditional music and song. The soldier and folklorist Hamish Henderson travelled the country recording people singing and telling stories. Henderson's own international Scots song, The Freedom Come All Ye, refers to the determination of Nelson Mandela in fighting for equality in South Africa, and was sung at the opening of the 2014 Commonwealth Games in Glasgow. In 1983, the most ambitious translation project ever undertaken in Scots came to fruition with the publication of the New Testament in Scots, translated by William Lawton Lorimer. Lorimer was a great scholar and translated the Gospels directly from their original Greek into Scots. Scots also featured heavily in Scottish drama of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Gregory Burke's hard-edged play about the Iraq War, Black Watch, Liz Lockheed's Mary Queen of Scots Got Her Head Chopped Off, and the acclaimed plays of Rona Munro all make use of Scots language, giving their characters realistic, convincing Scottish voices. The Scots language is now recognised by the European Commission for Regional and Minority Languages, the Scottish Government and the UK Government. Responses to the 2011 census showed that 1.5 million people in Scotland identified themselves as speaking or understanding Scots. Literature in Scots is more widely available than ever before, and a range of classic and contemporary texts and authors have been translated into Scots, including Alice in Wonderland, Roald Dahl, and Tintin. A Scots translation of Julia Donaldson's The Gruffalo has sold more than 45,000 copies. Scots is used in daily news and current affairs broadcasts from BBC Radio Orkney and BBC Radio Shetland. In nationwide broadcasting, Scots was the language of the hit comedy show Still Game. The monthly podcast from the Scots Language Centre, Scots Language Radio, remains the only dedicated national broadcast in Scots to cover the entire range of topics we might expect in a radio magazine, including archaeology, music, politics, and current affairs. In schools, Curriculum for Excellence highlights Scots as an important component of young people's education, and in the wider world, folk continue to speak Scots much as they've done for centuries. These days, the language is being used increasingly for advertising, business names, signs and menus, as well as in texts, instant messages and email. Government agencies have begun to develop their own Scots language policies. The Edinburgh Macker, Christine De Luca, comes from a Scots-speaking community in the west of Shetland and writes in the Shetland variety of Scots. Philippa Whitford, the consultant surgeon and Member of Parliament for Central Ayrshire, chose, on entering the House of Commons in May 2015, to take her vow in Scots. The Scots language has seen 7 centuries of mixed fortunes and sometimes difficult history. People who write or speak it, those working to promote the language, and those who simply love it, all share a strong sense of optimism about the future for Scots.